In April 1917, the United States joined the war. This was a plus for the Allies, but it was going to take time, months, possibly several years, before American strength could start to play a part in the war. The Allies still had to win, or at least to hold their own, before that time. Many, indeed, wanted to win before the Americans arrived so that the Americans would not take too large a share in deciding the terms of the peace. After 2 years of war, Joffre's hopeless and costly offences cost him his job. And early in 1917, a new French general appeared, General Robert Nivelle. Nivelle appealed to the English and to the Prime Minister Lloyd George because he had a fine command of the English language. He also appealed because he had a new design for war. Rather than the lengthy offensives preceded by massive, long bombardments, Nivelle proposed a strategy of what he called rupture, breakthrough. There would be very short preliminary artillery barrages, and then the troops would attack. If they met resistance, said Nivelle, then he would call a halt and attack elsewhere. Nivelle's design was tried on the Aisne on the 16th of April 1917 and rapidly ran into trouble. First, the weather was very bad and it was extremely wet. Secondly, the defences were too strong for Nivelle's method. And thirdly, Nivelle did not do what he had said he would do and break off the attack once it seemed to be failing. Rather, he threw more men into the fray. Within a matter of days, it was obvious that this new design had failed. Nivelle was sacked, and he was replaced by General Philippe Pétain. Pétain's task and the French task was now to survive. Pétain put it very simply. Let us, he said, attendre les chars et les Américains. We shall wait for the tanks and the Americans. The tanks would be produced by British and French factories in 1918. American manpower would come on stream in 1918. Until then, the French task was simply to hold out. That left Haig and the British and Commonwealth forces on their own to decide a strategy which might win the war before the Americans arrived. And that strategy revolved around the theatre of Passchendaele. Once again, Haig thought, and indeed sought, to break through the German lines. Afterwards, he would claim in his reports that he had been fighting a campaign of attrition, but this was not so. He was trying to break through into the Belgian plains and to the Belgian coast. The battle began in July of 1917 with a massive preliminary bombardment. The guns fired for 10 days and shot off 65,000 tons of shells. They turned the battlefield into the quagmire that we have all seen on television programs and in still photographs. The British forces found themselves trapped by exactly the same conditions that had brought them to a halt in 1916. By the end of the Somme campaign, casualty numbers are a very difficult thing to devise, but the British had suffered something like 300,000 casualties and the Germans something like 400,000 casualties. What the Allies were learning slowly and painfully was that attrition cut both ways. All was not, however, complete gloom, even though the Russians fell out of the war during 1917 and thus knocked away one of the Allied props, not one of the Central Powers props. During 1916-1917, British and Commonwealth forces were learning. They were learning how to use artillery more effectively and beginning to get more of it. They were learning how to use airplanes to assist ground attack. They were learning how to use intelligence and drawing much greater benefit from it. And finally, they were learning the techniques of infantry penetration against the massed lines of German barbed wire and German machine guns. Before all this could reach its climax, the Germans moved first. Running out of manpower, running out of munitions, and running out of time, Hindenburg and Ludendorff launched the last great offensive that the Germans had in their locker on the 21st of March, 1918. The design was simply to break through, to punch a hole, as one of the German commanders put it, in the Allied lines, and hope that that would be enough to destroy the willpower of nations that had been fighting for 4 years and whose blood had been drained, particularly on the soil of France and Flanders. The Germans had very little strength left, and although their troops fought hard, they were short of food and short of munitions. Eyewitnesses tell us that when they came across Allied food stores and dumps, everything stopped as the troops gorged themselves on rations that they could not find behind the lines or at home in Germany. They also realized that their opponent was better fed than they were, which can have done nothing for their morale. The Allies had operated a loose entente from 1914 to 1917. But the Battle of Passchendaele had changed things. After that battle, the Allies realized that what was necessary was much greater coordination across all the fronts of the war. And in the autumn of 1917, the Supreme War Council was set up. Yes, this was a talking shop, but at least it was a talking shop in which the generals and civilians of all the Allied powers still in the war could discuss how best to coordinate their efforts and how best to use resources which all of them, except America, were running out of. Now the German offensive of March 1918 added the last necessary ingredient. Brought almost to the pass of desperation, the Allied armies agreed to accept a single supreme commander, and they appointed General Ferdinand Foch as that commander. Able, because of greater strength, to resist the German attacks between March and July of 1918, the Allied forces in the West moved on to the offensive at the end of July, and their great charge began on the 8th of August. They now had tanks, which they had used in 1916 but had not yet really mastered. They had techniques such as close air-ground support. They had much more efficient and effective artillery, and they had new methods to attack the German lines. Nevertheless, this was the most bloody stage of the war. In the popular mind, it's thought that the bleeding occurred on the Somme in 1916 or at Passchendaele in 1917. This is not true. The greatest cost came in the battles in 1918 as the British, French and Allied forces fought their way towards the German frontier. Running out of everything, men, money, food, munitions, and probably even willpower, the Germans were forced in October 1918 to seek an armistice. The Allies, too, were by now seriously feeling the strain. Haig had been told at the beginning of 1918 that the troops he was getting were the last there were. There was nothing else left in the locker. The only power that had manpower resources, which were now coming into play in August, September, and October, was the United States. All the Allied commanders agreed that an armistice was necessary and appropriate. All save one, General Pershing, the American commander, who believed that it was necessary to continue the war and break into Germany itself in order to rub home the defeat of the German armies and the defeat of Prussian militarism, which after all was one of those goals that everybody had been fighting for. The war ended then without Allied armies penetrating into Germany. But there's one interesting might have been. At the very last moment, General Pétain, the commander of the French forces, planned and presented the idea of an Allied thrust deep into Alsace-Lorraine that would penetrate southern Germany. Had that happened, and it does make one think of Patton's thrust into Germany in 1944, although it would have been very different. Had it happened, then perhaps defeat would have been more demonstrably brought home to the Germans. But Pétain presented his plans in the very first days of November 1918, and an armistice had already been agreed upon. It took place on the 11th of November 1918, and the war was over. Russia, an ally at the start, Imperial Russia, had collapsed and disappeared. France and Great Britain were never to be quite the same places again. And that is demonstrated in the fact that it is a war that we still remember and lives with us still, both in our imagination and in our history.